Ohio, 2005. A cold case that haunted a small town for 2 decades has finally been solved. The community once rocked by fear now grapples with an even more shocking arrest. Helen Margaret Winslow, a 72-year-old retired librarian known for her kindness and book readings at the local elementary school, was found brutally murdered in her quiet home. No forced entry, no clear motive. Just a town left in shock and a family forever broken. For years, the case remained untouched, stalled by limited technology and a lack of answers. But today, with a stunning DNA breakthrough, justice has finally knocked. Before we begin, drop a comment with your country and the time right now. Ashford, Ohio, the kind of town where strangers wave, children ride bikes without worry, and life moves gently with the seasons. In 2005, it was a place untouched by violent crime, where families stayed for generations and the rhythm of small-town life gave comfort. At the heart of this community was Helen Margaret Winslow, a 72-year-old widow who had become something of a local legend. Helen lived alone in a charming, ivy-covered cottage on Willow Lane, a home built by her late husband Arthur, after returning from the Korean War. Arthur had passed away in the mid-1990s, but Helen never left the house. It was filled with memories, photographs in handmade frames, creaky floorboards that sang under her slippers, and shelves lined with worn books. She had once been the town's head librarian, a job she held for nearly 40 years before retiring. But retirement didn't slow her down. Every Tuesday and Thursday morning, Helen walked to the Ashford Elementary School to read to the children. She brought life to the pages of Charlotte's Web and Where the Red Fern Grows, captivating young imaginations with the warmth of her voice. For many students, Helen wasn't just a guest reader. She was the soul of the town's childhood. Neighbors often saw her in the garden pruning hydrangeas, feeding the neighborhood cats, or attending Sunday service at St. Matthew's Methodist Church. She sent handwritten birthday cards, always signed in blue ink, and baked pies for every church fundraiser. There wasn't a single person in Ashford who hadn't encountered her kindness in some form. She was the last person you'd think of when you think of something bad happening. One neighbor would later recall, she was Ashford's heartbeat. Helen had no children of her own, but she had nieces and nephews scattered across Ohio who visited on holidays and called regularly. Her days were slow, simple, and deliberate, filled with purpose and routine. And that routine was never broken, which is why November 13, 2005 stood out like a dropped pin on an otherwise smooth map. That morning, Helen was supposed to read at Ashford Elementary at 9 a.m., but she never arrived. By 10, Saudi concern spread like a chill down the spine. Teachers made calls. Her neighbor, June Fletcher, who usually saw her on her morning walk, noticed the front curtains were still drawn. The mailbox was full, the morning paper untouched, and the porch light still flickered in the sunlight. Calls to Helen's landline went unanswered. No one had seen her since the previous afternoon. By midday, a welfare check was requested. Police officers approached her home and knocked. No response. They circled the house. No broken windows, no obvious signs of forced entry. Eventually, using a key from a trusted neighbor, they entered. Inside, the house was silent. The kettle was still warm. The air smelled faintly of cinnamon, maybe from the scone she had baked the day before. But Helen was nowhere to be seen. And so, the question began to echo through Ashford like a siren in slow motion. How does a 72-year-old woman, beloved and rooted in routine, simply vanish without a trace? The search was just beginning. The answers, and the horror, had yet to unfold. What would police find behind the doors of that warm, familiar home? November 13, 2005. It was a Sunday morning marked by a crisp chill in the air, the kind that hinted winter was near. Ashford's trees stood half naked, their leaves carpeting the sidewalks in shades of amber and rust. Life was slow that day. Coffee brewed in quiet kitchens. Church bells rang softly in the distance. But for Helen Margaret Winslow, this would be her final morning. Helen had promised to read to Mrs. Weller's third-grade class, a regular session she never missed. Charlotte's Web was on the schedule, a story she'd read so many times she could almost do it by heart. The children loved her, not just for the stories, but for the warm peppermints she handed out afterward, always wrapped in wax paper with a handwritten quote. By 9:15, a slight concern rippled through the classroom. By 10 it had grown into quiet worry. Helen was never late, Not once in all the years she'd read to the children. Mrs. Weller made a call. Then another. When no one picked up, she reached out to June Fletcher, Helen's next-door neighbor and longtime friend. June, still in her robe, slipped on boots and walked next door, her instincts already uneasy. The signs were immediate. Helen's porch light was still on, something she always turned off at dawn. Her newspaper, which she usually read over breakfast, sat untouched on the steps, and her curtains, usually drawn open to let the morning sun pour in, were still closed. June knocked, then rang the bell, then called out. No answer. Her chest tightened. This wasn't right. Helen was a creature of habit. Something was wrong. She called the Ashford Police Department and requested a welfare check. Officers arrived shortly after noon. June handed them the spare key Helen had once entrusted to her, just in case. What they found behind the door was something no one in Ashford could have imagined. The inside of the home was still and warm, the air tinged with the faint aroma of burning wood from the fireplace. Still glowing low in the corner, on the table beside her favorite armchair was a half-finished cup of chamomile tea. A pair of reading glasses rested on the armrest. The TV was off. No signs of struggle, at least at first glance. Then they saw her. Helen Winslow lay motionless on the rug, her arms curled at her sides. A pillow, slightly bloodied, had been cast aside. Her face bore bruises and her neck had markings that led investigators to one grim conclusion. She had been strangled. There was no forced entry. No broken glass. Nothing stolen. Her purse was still on the side table, her keys hanging on their usual hook. Even her wallet, with nearly $100 inside, was untouched. This wasn't a robbery. It was something far more intimate. The officers secured the scene, but even seasoned investigators found themselves rattled. Helen had no known enemies, no romantic entanglements, no disputes, and yet someone had come into her home, perhaps invited, and taken her life. Word spread quickly. A beloved figure known for bedtime stories and baked goods had been murdered in the heart of Ashford. And there was something even more chilling. She likely knew her killer. Someone she let inside, someone she trusted, so who would do this to Helen Winslow? And how close were they to her door? The answers at the time remained locked inside a silent house. The officers who entered Helen Winslow's home that day would later describe the scene as eerily peaceful. Nothing about the living room screamed violence. No shattered glass, no overturned furniture, no signs of a frantic escape, and yet in that stillness lay the unmistakable weight of something horrific. Helen's body had been positioned with unsettling care, her hands at her sides, her legs gently angled, almost as if someone wanted her to appear at rest. It wasn't chaos. It was deliberate. It felt personal. Beside her chair, a half-drunk cup of chamomile tea remained. The teabag string dangled neatly over the edge, and a spoon rested on the saucer. The cup was still warm when police arrived, a detail that chilled investigators. It meant the killer had acted swiftly after she sat down, perhaps even while she was still holding the cup. On a nearby end table sat her well-worn copy of Little Women, open to a chapter about sacrifice. The book's position and the fact that her reading glasses were still resting on the armrest suggested she'd been reading. Moments before she was attacked, the initial forensic sweep found no fingerprints, not on the teacup, not on the door handles, not even on the pillow later believed to have been used in the attack. It was as if the killer had worn gloves, or had cleaned up afterward. There was no sign of forced entry, and the locks hadn't been tampered with. Police immediately considered that Helen had let the person in, likely someone she knew or at the very least didn't fear. The autopsy results came in 2 days later. The cause of death? Manual strangulation with strong compression marks around the neck and bruising consistent with a pillow being used to smother. There were also defensive wounds on Helen's hands and forearms. She had tried to fight back. Scratch marks under her fingernails hinted at a struggle, but they would later yield no viable DNA under 2005's testing limitations. This wasn't a random break-in. It wasn't a robbery gone wrong. It was something darker, a targeted killing. Word of Helen's death spread through Ashford like wildfire. At first, the community held its breath, hoping for an immediate arrest, a clear suspect. But as hours turned into days, speculation took over. Some feared the attack was the work of a transient, someone passing through town who had chosen her at random. Others believed the killer had to be local, someone close, someone hiding in plain sight. People started looking at their neighbors differently. Trust, once abundant, began to erode. Churchgoers whispered in pews. Library patrons avoided the quiet reading rooms. Parents began walking their children to school, even though crime had been nearly non-existent in Ashford for decades. Helen's death had done something more than end a life. It had cracked open a town's sense of safety, yet even in the midst of confusion and grief, one chilling truth began to settle in. Helen had known her killer. She had invited them in, sat with them, poured tea maybe, perhaps even laughed, moments before her life ended, and the crime scene, so hauntingly pristine, held its secrets tightly. Would the carefully staged clues inside Helen's living room finally speak? Or had her killer vanished without leaving a single trace? In the days following Helen Winslow's murder, the Ashford Police Department launched a full-scale investigation, determined to bring justice to the town's most beloved figure. Detectives worked around the clock, retracing every step of Helen's final day. But the more they searched, the more elusive the truth became. They began with the obvious, Helen's inner circle. Her library co-workers were interviewed extensively. None reported anything unusual. Her volunteer work at the elementary school raised no red flags. Helen had no stalkers, no bitter feuds, no secret romances. Detectives then turned their attention to local teens she had occasionally scolded for loitering or vandalizing the library garden. A few names surfaced, but none had records beyond petty mischief, and all had alibis. Interviews with neighbors were just as fruitless. No strange visitors had been seen. No unusual vehicles. No disturbances. Investigators combed through old repair invoices, thinking perhaps a handyman or delivery person might have taken advantage of her trust. One former electrician had moved out of state. Another retired. Both cleared. They even pursued the unlikely, an estranged niece Helen hadn't spoken to in years. But she was living in another state and hadn't been in contact since the late 90s. At every turn, the leads collapsed. The most promising piece of evidence, a partial DNA sample collected from under Helen's fingernails, was too degraded for 2005's testing standards. It offered hope but no resolution. Back then, genetic sequencing was primitive, and unless a suspect's full profile was already in the system, matches were near impossible. The crime scene yielded no usable fingerprints, and investigators were left with nothing but speculation. Helen's funeral was held 1 week after her death. Hundreds showed up. Former students, church members, neighbors, all gathered in candlelight to honor the woman who had given so much to their community. The service was filled with tears, hymns, and unanswered questions. Ashford, once a place of unlocked doors and borrowed cups of sugar, began to feel colder. Residents double-checked their locks. Children were no longer allowed to roam as freely. Fear had taken root, not from what was known, but from what wasn't. In the weeks that followed, journalists descended on Ashford, searching for a headline. Some suggested the crime had been committed by a drifter. Others hinted at a darker secret in the quiet town. But after a few months, the cameras disappeared. Reporters moved on, and Ashford was left alone with its grief. Detectives kept the case active for months. Tip lines were opened. A $5,000 reward was offered. Nothing came of it. Eventually, even the investigators had to admit what the town already feared. The case had gone cold. Helen's file joined a growing stack in the department's unsolved cabinet. A thick folder filled with photos, interview transcripts, and an evidence list that read like a dead end. Still, her family never stopped calling. Every holiday, someone would leave flowers at her front porch. On the anniversary of her death, June Fletcher would light a candle and read a passage from Helen's favorite book aloud on her porch. The town tried to move on, but it never quite did. Helen's absence left a void. Her stories no longer filled the school halls. Her laughter no longer drifted through open windows. And her killer? They had vanished. Without a trace. Without a motive. Without remorse. Would the trail ever warm again? Or had Ashford's most haunting mystery faded into silence for good? In the quiet years that followed Helen Winslow's murder, time did what it always does. It moved on. Seasons passed through Ashford like the gentle sweep of a clock's hand. Trees bloomed, children graduated, homes changed hands. But inside a locked cabinet at the Ashford Police Department, a thick manila file sat untouched. Labeled in bold black ink, Winslow, Helen M. in 11/13/2005. It was a case that had once consumed the town. Now it was a haunting memory. For Helen's family scattered across Ohio, the pain didn't fade. They remembered her for who she was. The great-aunt who mailed handmade Christmas cards, the woman who baked cinnamon bread from scratch every Thanksgiving, and the quiet comfort who called just to ask how work was going. Her absence was felt in ways large and small. No holiday passed without a silent seat at the table. Ashford, too, bore the scar. Though residents eventually stopped locking their doors in broad daylight, a layer of trust had been peeled back, one that never fully returned. The library where Helen once read to children kept her portrait on the back wall, now faded and slightly askew. Every now and then, someone would stop to straighten it. In 2015, a shift came. A newly appointed police chief, Daniel Reese, took office. Younger, tech-savvy, and driven by a commitment to community trust, Reese made a public promise to revisit cold cases, starting with the most haunting. Helen's case was one of the first pulled. Detectives reread the interviews, re-examined photographs, and tried to build new momentum. They reached out to Helen's family again, requesting any small detail they might have missed. Old letters, visitor names, anything. But there were no breakthroughs, no new suspects, and despite some improvements in forensic tech, the degraded DNA sample from Helen's case still fell below the threshold for a viable profile. The team hit a wall. Again. Though Helen's case was never officially closed, it drifted back into the shadows. Investigators, bound by protocol and limited resources, could do little but wait. Still, the community remembered. Each November, on the anniversary of her death, a group of residents, led by June Fletcher, held a candlelight vigil on the steps of the library. They lit candles and read from Little Women, Helen's favorite book. The children she once read to were now adults. Some had moved away. Some stayed. A few even brought their own children to the library, pointing to the worn photo of the woman who once brought stories to life. Then, in late 2022, nearly 17 years after the murder, something shifted. Ohio had recently joined a new federal program that encouraged local departments to resubmit cold case evidence to private forensic labs using advanced genetic genealogy technology. It was part of a broader push to address the national backlog of unsolved murders. Ashford PD submitted Helen's file. And this time something happened. The lab reported that the degraded DNA sample, once considered unusable, now showed enough genetic markers to potentially identify a relative through public ancestry databases. It was a faint trail, not a name, not a suspect, but a lead, and after nearly 2 decades, even a whisper of progress felt like thunder, because along with the new technology came something else entirely unexpected. A name. But could this name finally bring answers? Or would it add another layer of mystery to a case already too painful to bear? By early 2023, Ashford's cold case files were no longer gathering dust. A federal grant, part of a national initiative to solve violent crimes using forensic innovation, allowed small departments like Ashford PD to outsource DNA evidence to private genetic genealogy labs, a resource they'd never had access to before. Chief Daniel Reese, still determined to fulfill his vow to Helen's family, resubmitted the DNA sample from under her fingernails, the same one that had frustrated investigators for years. This time the results came from VeriGen, a cutting-edge lab specializing in solving cold cases through ancestral mapping. Within weeks, the lab contacted Ashford PD with a stunning revelation. A viable partial profile had been developed. The breakthrough didn't come from CODIS, the national criminal DNA database, but from a public genealogy platform where a distant cousin had uploaded their DNA in hopes of building a family tree. That upload had inadvertently provided the missing puzzle piece. Through reverse engineering the genetic connections, lab analysts narrowed the search to a specific Ohio-based family tree, one branch of which led investigators to a man who had once lived just 3 blocks from Helen Winslow at the time of her murder. His name, Gregory Allan Tripp. He was 59 now, living quietly in rural Kentucky. In 2005, Tripp had been a local handyman known for minor repair jobs: gutters, roof patches, fence repairs. Records confirmed he had done work for Helen a few months before her death. His name had never been flagged. He had no criminal record, no history of violence, just a quiet, forgettable presence. But when the lab's report placed a 99.98% probability match between the unknown DNA and Tripp's genetic lineage, Ashford PD knew they had to act. Carefully. They didn't want to spook him. A small task force, working discreetly with Kentucky authorities, initiated surveillance. They tracked Tripp's movements, his work habits, routines. They needed a fresh DNA sample to confirm the match without alerting him. Then came a break. Tripp visited a local hardware store one afternoon and tossed a soda can into a public trash bin. It was retrieved within the hour, carefully sealed, and rushed to the lab. The results came back 2 days later. Direct match. The DNA found beneath Helen Winslow's fingernails, the sample that had lingered in cold storage for nearly 2 decades, matched Gregory Allan Tripp with certainty. For Ashford PD, it was both a triumph and a moment of disbelief. After all these years, after endless false starts and sorrowful holidays for Helen's family, they finally had a name. A suspect, a traceable thread to the truth. But solving a cold case is one thing. Prosecuting it, especially after so much time, is another battle entirely. Legal experts were immediately brought in to assess the strength of the case. Would a jury find decades-old DNA enough to convict? Could the defense argue contamination, mistaken identity, or mishandling? There were no eyewitnesses, no confession, just science, and a story no one had been able to tell fully until now. Still, Ashford PD knew they had to move forward. For Helen, for her family, for a town that had waited long enough. But would Gregory Tripp face the justice system? Or would time, loopholes, and legal red tape offer him an escape after all these years? On April 18, 2024, after nearly 2 decades of silence, the wheels of justice finally turned. At 6:42 a.m., a SWAT team, along with Ashford PD and Kentucky State Police, surrounded a modest 1-story house on the outskirts of Bowling Green, Kentucky. Inside, Gregory Allan Tripp, now 59, was just waking up. He had lived there for over 10 years. Quiet, unassuming, a handyman still working odd jobs, gutter repair, yard maintenance, occasional painting gigs, the kind of man people hired without remembering his name. He opened the door, groggy and barefoot, to the sight of armed officers. "Gregory Allan Tripp," one officer said, "you're under arrest for the 2005 murder of Helen Margaret Winslow." He didn't speak. Not a word. Just blinked in confusion, or perhaps calculation, as the cuffs were locked around his wrists. The arrest hit Ashford like a thunderclap. Within hours, the town was abuzz. Local news stations broadcast the footage on a loop. People gathered outside the Ashford Library, stunned and whispering in disbelief. The man who had quietly patched Helen's roof in the summer of 2005 had, according to investigators, returned months later to end her life. Helen's family broke down in tears when they got the call. Her great-niece, now a teacher herself, clutched an old photo of Helen and whispered, "We didn't forget you." Her former neighbor, June Fletcher, stood outside Helen's now vacant home and sobbed. "He was just ordinary," she told reporters. "Polite, quiet. I remember seeing him on the ladder cleaning her gutters. I waved to him. He waved back. The horror of that realization, that the man they had once trusted in their neighborhood was the same man now accused of murdering. Their friend was almost too much to bear. The details began to emerge slowly. Tripp had left Ashford 2 weeks after Helen's murder, selling his pickup truck and abandoning the rental he had lived in. He'd relocated to Kentucky, changed his phone number, and lived under the radar ever since. He'd never been arrested, never raised suspicion. He built a life in the shadows, 1 gig at a time. Authorities described the arrest as peaceful but tense. Tripp was transported to Ohio under heavy guard, arriving in Franklin County where he was booked and formally charged with first-degree murder. In his mugshot, Tripp stared straight ahead, gaunt, gray-stubbled, and expressionless. The community demanded answers. How had someone so utterly forgettable committed such a cruel, intimate act? Why Helen? Was it rage? Rejection? Opportunity? Investigators remained tight-lipped about a motive. Inside the interrogation room, Tripp said little. When shown the DNA evidence, he reportedly muttered, "I didn't mean to hurt her." But he offered no further explanation. Ashford was left reeling. People revisited memories, asking themselves what signs they missed. Did Helen know something? Had she suspected anything in those final moments? The library held a vigil that night. Dozens came, candles flickering against the evening wind. Someone left a note that read, "We remember. We always remembered." As Tripp awaited his arraignment, media descended once again. The small courtroom would soon host one of the most anticipated trials in Ashford's history. But before justice could be weighed, there was one question left hanging in the air, colder than any Ohio winter. What would Gregory Tripp reveal, if anything, when finally forced to face a courtroom and speak the truth? January 2025. Nearly 20 years after the murder of Helen Margaret Winslow, the man accused of ending her life stood before a judge and jury. The trial of Gregory Allan Tripp opened in the Franklin County Courthouse, drawing local reporters, retired investigators, and members of the Ashford community, who had waited nearly 2 decades for this moment. Tripp sat quietly beside his defense team, wearing a dark suit and an unreadable expression. He appeared older than his 59 years, pale, sunken eyes, hands twitching occasionally under the table. But no amount of age or silence could blunt what the state was about to unveil. The prosecution began with the DNA. They explained to the jury how the fingernail scrapings, collected from Helen's body in 2005, had sat dormant for years, unusable with the forensic limitations of the time. But thanks to advances in genetic genealogy and high-resolution sequencing, those samples were now a genetic match to Tripp. Not a partial match, not speculative, but a direct confirmation backed by scientific rigor. Then came the testimony from Ashford residents. Neighbors described Tripp's handyman work in the area, including multiple visits to Helen's home in the months before her death. One neighbor recalled seeing Tripp and Helen on her porch in the late summer of 2005, chatting over lemonade. Another said Helen had mentioned a handyman who talked too much but did good work. When questioned by detectives in the days after the murder, Tripp's original statements had been vague. Now the prosecution highlighted inconsistencies. He had claimed he hadn't seen Helen in over a year, yet utility payment records showed him working in her neighborhood just weeks before the crime. He said he had moved because of a job opportunity, but his sudden departure, lack of forwarding address, and abandoned belongings painted a different picture. The defense attempted to poke holes in the timeline. They claimed Tripp's memory was poor, that he suffered from depression and had trouble recalling events from 20 years prior. They argued that the DNA evidence could have been transferred, contaminated, that no eyewitness had placed him at the scene that night. But the argument fell flat. Then came Helen's family. Her great-niece, now in her 30s, took the stand and described the moment she found out Helen had been killed. She described the silence that followed. Holidays without her, birthdays without cards, the emotional wound that never healed. She was gentle, she said through tears. She would have offered her killer a glass of water if they asked. And that's what makes this so hard. The prosecution ended with a photo. Helen, standing outside the library in 2003, smiling with a book in hand and a group of schoolchildren gathered around her. She didn't deserve to be forgotten, the prosecutor said, and today we ask this jury not only to remember Helen Winslow, but to speak for her. The jury deliberated for 7 days, and then, in a packed courtroom, the verdict was read, guilty of first-degree murder. There was silence, then gasps, then quiet sobs. Tripp showed no visible emotion. His hands stayed folded. He was led out of the courtroom shackled and silent. For Helen's family, it was a moment of release, not joy, not closure, but acknowledgement. The truth had been spoken aloud in the same county where her story had been silenced. But beyond the justice rendered, the case forced a broader question. How many others like Helen and vulnerable, trusting and alone, have slipped through the cracks? And how many are still waiting unheard for justice to finally arrive? Ashford has changed since 2005. New homes have gone up. The school has been renovated. Children who once sat cross-legged on the library carpet are now adults with children of their own. But one thing remains untouched: the memory of Helen Margaret Winslow. Outside the Ashford Public Library, where Helen dedicated most of her life, a modest wooden bench now stands under the shade of an old maple tree. It faces east, catching the morning sun, just as Helen liked it. Carved into its backrest are the words, "For Helen, who never stopped reading to us." Every fall near the anniversary of her death, the community gathers for a memorial book drive in her honor. Residents donate children's books, many of which are stamped with Helen's name inside the cover. These books are gifted to schools, foster homes, and shelters across Ohio. Her great-niece, Sarah Winslow, is now a third-grade teacher at Ashford Elementary, the same school where Helen once read Charlotte's Web aloud. Each year, Sarah stands in front of her class, holding that same worn copy her great-aunt used decades ago. And in Helen's voice, soft, deliberate, kind, she reads the words that once enchanted a generation of children. "She made you feel like you were the only one in the room," Sarah says. It's not just the stories, it's the way she made you feel safe inside them. But Helen's legacy isn't just emotional, it's legislative. Her cold case, once gathering dust for years, became a catalyst for reform. After the conviction of Gregory Tripp, Ohio's Attorney General launched a review of hundreds of unsolved murders involving degraded DNA samples. The state allocated additional funds for small-town police departments to access advanced forensic services. Helen's name was referenced in the bill itself, the Winslow Initiative for Cold Case Reform. Since the program's inception, over 24 cold cases have been reopened. Several have led to arrests. Others have yielded new evidence. What was once considered the end of the line has, in many cases, become a new beginning, all sparked by a librarian who refused to be forgotten. For the Ashford community, Helen became a symbol of perseverance. Her story proved that even the softest voices matter, that even in silence, truth waits, that science, when paired with commitment, can speak for the dead. The library created a small reading room in her name. Sunlight floods the space in the early morning, casting long beams across shelves filled with classics. On the wall hangs a framed quote, "To read to a child is to leave a legacy." Helen's absence is still felt, in the echo of a quiet library, in the empty space during Sunday service, in the porch light that no longer glows next door. But her presence is just as real. It lives on in every whispered bedtime story, every crayon-drawn thank you card, every book opened in her name. She was never just a victim. She was a force of kindness, of memory, of meaning. Helen Winslow didn't just live in Ashford. She helped build it, one page at a time. And though her story ends in justice, her voice continues, in every chapter still being written. Helen Margaret Winslow was never just a name in a case file. She was a heartbeat in the town of Ashford, Ohio. A retired librarian with a gentle soul, she filled classrooms with stories, church halls with kindness, and her neighborhood with warmth. Her presence was quiet but profound. Her absence, after that cold November morning in 2005, left a silence that echoed for years. Her murder devastated those who loved her. For nearly 2 decades, her family lived in uncertainty, their questions unanswered, their grief compounded by a lack of justice. The community, too, carried the weight. A town that once believed it was safe now haunted by an invisible threat. When forensic science finally caught up with truth, Helen's voice was restored. DNA didn't just identify her killer. It resurrected her story, brought closure to her family, and reminded the world that no case should ever be considered too cold to solve. Gregory Tripp's arrest and conviction did more than deliver justice. It reignited trust, reopened conversations about forgotten victims, and inspired change. Through the Winslow Initiative for Cold Case Reform, Ohio now channels resources into solving decades-old crimes. Helen's case became the tipping point for dozens of other reopened investigations. Today, her story is more than tragedy. It's transformation. She lives on in every book drive every child read to, every case file reopened in her name. Let her legacy remind us. Behind every cold case is a name worth remembering, a voice worth hearing, and a life worth honoring. If Helen's story moved you, subscribe, share, and keep her memory alive, because justice delayed must never be justice denied. Justice for Helen, justice for all still waiting.